All right, let's look at some sentencing models. Of course, statutes and jurisdictions where crimes are committed will ultimately determine what penalties the court may impose. And that leads us to this idea of indeterminate sentences. This is based on the belief that sentences should fit the crime and that the treatment should fit the offender. It's intended to individualize sentences. As you can imagine, the law may issue a minimum or maximum sentence for the crime committed, but the judge is able to fix the sentence within that range. This type of sentencing allows for flexibility in the type of sentence imposed and the length of time served. Now, the ability for a judge to exercise discretion has been limited and or granted more or less at different times in our history. The three strikes you're out rule, of course, ultimately took the judge's discretion away from the reality of that third strike, even though that third strike might have been something that really didn't warrant the type of punishment that came about because of the three strikes and you're out rule. Another thing to keep in mind is determinate sentences. This is a fixed term of incarceration. Many people consider determinate sentences, in many respects, are too restrictive for the rehabilitation purposes that we hope our criminal justice system is striving for. The advantage, of course, is that offenders know how much time they're going to serve. This ultimately results in regulating the length of sentences and curbing judicial discretion, which led to the creation of sentencing guidelines. So, once again, this is a rule that takes discretion away from a judge. Of course, we have to consider sentencing guidelines. This is the set of standards that define the parameters a trial judge has to follow when they ultimately dole out the sentence. And as a general rule, the severity of the crime and the offender's prior criminal history should come to play in the doling out of punishment. Something else that we have to consider is the future of guidelines, right? Until recently, some states used presumptive sentencing guidelines, which merely suggests rather than mandate sentences, whereas others used presumptive sentencing guidelines. We are now required to have judges use guidelines to shape those decisions. Something we need to take in consideration here, of course, is Blakely versus Washington. This is where the Supreme Court found Washington State's sentencing guidelines were a violation of the defendant's Sixth Amendment rights. And the judge determined the offense involved deliberate cruelty, which must be determined ultimately by a jury. And we also need to take in consideration United States versus Booker. Here, the court ruled that federal guidelines were unconstitutional. Judges should consider the guideline ranges, but must also be permitted to alter sentences in consideration of other facts. This is the Supreme Court bringing discretion back to the judges. And before these Supreme Court cases, presumptive guidelines had been criticized as being rigid, harsh, overly complex, and disliked by the judiciary. State and federal courts are now addressing these issues and creating mechanisms for proper administration of guidelines. Although the guidelines are now advisory rather than mandatory, they still have a great deal of impact on sentencing decisions. Mandatory sentences, of course, once again, limiting the judges' ability to use discretion, and ultimately were a response to getting tough on crime. They've increased the size of the correctional population. I talked earlier about the three strikes law, right? And this was where we designed to impose longer sentences upon career or chronic violent offenders. This had a substantial public and political base. It was strongly supported. And it may be the reason for increases in prison population. And there's some evidence that offenders are held accountable for relatively minor but violent crimes that happened decades ago. So you could have gotten in trouble a long time ago, and that was a strike, and then you kind of rehabilitated yourself, and you were doing things that, you were kind of keeping yourself in line, and you got two lesser strikes and found yourself incarcerated for a long time. The three strikes laws have been challenged on constitutional grounds. The Supreme Court upheld sentencing of Leonard Andrade and Gary Ewing not so grossly disproportionate as to violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So this is the Supreme Court once again looking at the rights of a citizen in reference to the state's imposition of a punishment. This brings us to imposing the sentence, and what we know is that judges' sentences are based on a variety of information that's available to them, such as the impact statements made by victims and the pre-sentence investigation reports by the probation department. Sentences may be composed in one of two ways. They can be concurrent or they can be consecutive. Concurrent are sentences served simultaneously. Consecutive are sentences served one after another. And as you can imagine, especially in a overbloated criminal justice system, concurrent sentencing is the norm. And then, of course, we have to take into effect the effect of good time. And this is where if an inmate follows the prison rules, then they may accrue days that reduce their prison sentence. So getting out before the full term of their sentence. Here are some different ways of seeing sentencing actually play out. So take, for example, a rape happens, and rape is punishable by 10 years in prison. Possession of a handgun is punishable by 3 years in prison, and possession of heroin by 4 years in prison. So maybe you rape somebody, you have a handgun, and you're caught with heroin. In the consecutive sentencing scenario, rape plus possession of a handgun plus possession of heroin, that's 17 years. Each sentence must be served individually. In the concurrent sentencing, rape plus possession of a handgun plus possession of heroin equals 10 years. Because all sentences are served simultaneously. So, if you commit a crime, you're hoping that they're bringing the concurrent sentencing and not the consecutive sentencing. This brings up how people are ultimately sentenced. The federal government conducts surveys on sentencing practices in state and federal courts. More than 1 million adults are convicted of a felony every year. 70% of the felonies convicted in state courts are sentenced to a period of confinement. 40% of the state prison and 30% go to local jails. The remaining 30% are sentenced to straight probation. Felons are sentenced in state prison, ultimately had an average sentence of 4.5 years, but were likely to only serve half of that. About 1/3 of all sentenced offenders are typically expected to pay a fine, pay victim restitution, receive treatment, perform community service, or comply with some other additional penalty. So if you've ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony, you know you get you got to go to jail, and then when you come out, you got to do some community service. You got to check in with probation officer, parole officer. There's other stuff that you got to do than just going and sitting in a jail cell. Violent offenders are generally given prison sentences that average about 8 years, and property offenders typically get sentenced to about 4. And the number of convicted offenders being sent to prison is lower than a decade ago, ultimately due to the increasing popularity of cost-effective community sentencing. So we're going to do some rehabilitation on the front end, and we're going to prevent people from being a long-term stay in a federal penitentiary or a state penitentiary due to any particular offense. Let's see. How are people sentenced? This is the mean and median sentencing length of offense type and felony defendants. So, number of months, all offenses about 52 months. That's your mean, and your median is 30 months. Violent offenders, you're getting 91 months and 48 months. Murder, well, it is what it is. The average and the median are real close here. Rape, about 142 months. The mean and 120 months, or 120 months is the median. You can see what your sentencing looks like. My guess is you don't want to be having to process whether this is happening to you or not. You might ask yourself, what factors ultimately affect sentencing? Well, state sentencing codes include various factors that can legitimately influence the length of one's sentence. First, the severity of the offense. What'd you do, and how bad was it? Second, do you have a prior criminal record? Have you been in front of a judge before, and what was it that brought you in front of that judge? Third, whether the offender used violence. And this next one goes hand in hand, whether the offender used weapons. And ultimately, whether the crime was committed for money. Research shows a strong correlation between these legal variables and the type and length of sentencing received. Judges sentence more sentences in several cases involving the most serious criminal charges are going to reflect upon these important variables, and people with prior felony convictions are much more likely to receive prison time than those convicted of misdemeanors.